Local broadcast of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by Davis Wright Tremaine, a law firm serving businesses and individuals from offices in Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, Alaska, and Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm Roger Mudd in New York.
And I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington. After our summary of the news this Monday, we examine the new fighting in the Middle East. Then come a report on the siege of Sarajevo, a look at the economic costs of the floods in the Midwest, and an essay about cheeseburgers and the federal budget.
New York Life is proud to provide funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour. Yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. Funding has also been provided by PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
The flooded Midwest prepared for more rain today. Levees grew weaker as the Mississippi and Missouri rivers continued to rise. Residents in Perryville, Missouri were evacuated yesterday after a levee gave way. Waters from the Mississippi River flooded the town. Floodwaters from the Missouri River shut down water treatment plants in St. Joseph, Missouri and Brownville, Nebraska. Officials in both towns say water could be restored by midweek. DeWitt, Nebraska experienced heavy winds and rain today after tornadoes and floodwaters raced through the town over the weekend. We'll have more on the impact of the floods later in the program. More than 2,000 people are dead from flooding in southern Asia, and officials said today thousands more could die from disease. The flooding has struck northern India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, where almost half the country is underwater. The water is from unusually fierce annual monsoons. Officials said the risk of cholera is high because millions of people have been left homeless with no medical supplies and only contaminated water to drink. Roger?
President Clinton called on Congress today to get on with it, as he put it. He spoke as House and Senate budget conferees are negotiating over two versions of the president's budget plan. Both would cut about $500 billion from the deficit through a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. Mr. Clinton said prospects for the economic recovery hinge on the conferees working out their differences quickly. He spoke at a conference on business worker relations in Chicago.
The government needs to pass this budget and get on with the rest of the business. Hanging out there, debating it, dragging it out for weeks and weeks will only make it worse. There comes a time when delay to get a slightly better decision is worse than action to get a pretty good decision. We have reached that time. We don't need to do that. We got other things to do. And you need to know what the rules are going to be, what the deal is, and we need to go on with our lives.
Congressional leaders have given the conferees a Thursday deadline for finishing their negotiations.
There was a second day of Israeli air and artillery attacks on South Lebanon today. The intended targets were Muslim guerrilla bases. The guerrillas responded by firing rockets back at northern Israel. More than 35 people have been killed in the cross-border fighting. Israeli officials said the attacks were retaliation for guerrilla offensives that killed 7 Israeli soldiers. We have a report narrated by Louise Bates of Worldwide Television News.
Israel's Thunder Artillery Battalion has fired thousands of shells into southern Lebanon. The relentless barrage, part of a multi-pronged bombardment. Guerrilla bases were targeted, but scores of civilians have been killed or injured, and there's no sign of an end to the conflict. The scale of the onslaught has caused outrage in the Muslim world. The Israeli government argues it was provoked into the attack. Israeli settlements have been repeatedly hit by rockets, inflicting civilian and military casualties. Caught under the Israeli firestorm, the Irish UN peacekeeping force. Several soldiers have been injured. Thousands of Lebanese have fled. The bombardment targeting Palestinian camps in the ports of Sidon and Tripoli, as well as mountain strongholds. In northern Israel, children are being evacuated, and the civilian population is spending a second night in shelters. The funeral for 2 Israelis killed on Sunday spilled over into anger. and the Israeli military says it will continue to hit the guerrillas hard.
We'll have more on this story right after the news summary. United Nations peacekeepers in Bosnia blamed Serbs today for an attack on their base in Sarajevo. Officials said the Serbs Sunday fired nearly 70 shells that hit the base. No one was injured, but several vehicles were destroyed. The UN commander called the attack cowardly and said next time the Serbs would face immediate retaliation. Bosnia's Muslim president arrived in Geneva today for a new round of peace talks. The negotiations open tomorrow on a Serb-Croat proposal to split the republic into 3 ethnic states.
Despite new racial violence, politicians in South Africa pressed ahead today with their talks on sharing political power. 11 people were killed and 52 injured when gunmen opened fire last night at a predominantly white church near Cape Town. We have a report from Jeremy Thompson of Independent Television News.
Carnage in church, the ultimate sacrilege. Bodies lay among the shattered pews. The church of St. James's had been packed with over 1,400 worshippers for the regular Sunday evening service. The 5 masked attackers had burst in, hurling grenades and spraying the congregation with automatic rifle fire. The horror felt in the local community translated into a sense of outrage across the country.
It is an act that is clearly designed to undermine the negotiation process.
We are adamant that the overwhelming peaceful majority of South Africa should not allow the evil forces behind this to disrail and derail the peace process with which we are busy.
The multi-party negotiators observed a minute's silence for the massacre victims before starting one of their most crucial debates, approving the new draft constitution that will pave the way for South Africa's first non-racial elections. Most politicians here suspected it was this democratic process that was the real target of the unknown forces bent on destabilizing the country.
The multi-party elections have been scheduled for next April. They will end white minority rule and give the nation's black majority voting rights for the first time in South Africa's history. Russian President Boris Yeltsin today relaxed a currency reform plan in hopes of averting a political crisis. On Saturday, Russia's central bank voided old ruble notes and gave people 2 weeks to exchange their old notes for new ones, but limiting all cash transactions to $35. Any excess would be locked in a savings account for 6 months. The move was intended to slow the rate of inflation by taking money out of circulation. What it did instead was prompt howls of protest from the public and hardline lawmakers. So today, Yeltsin gave people 3 more weeks to exchange their old rubles and substantially increased the ceiling on cash transactions.
An airliner crashed today in South Korea. 62 of the 106 people on board were killed. The Boeing 737 plowed into a wooded hillside during a storm, but the exact cause of the crash was not known. The plane was on a domestic flight from Seoul to a southern city. Witnesses said the plane made 3 attempts at landing before it went down.
General Matthew Ridgway died in his sleep today at the age of 98. He was one of the 20th century's leading combat generals. Ridgway created the Army's 1st Airborne Division, the 82nd, and led its assault into France on D-Day. Ridgway, who was a 4-star general, replaced General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War and brought the 8th Army back from the edge of defeat. In 1952, he succeeded General Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Ridgway died at his home near Pittsburgh. That's it for the news summary. Just ahead on the News Hour, new fighting in the Middle East, the continuing war in Bosnia, the economic impact of the flood of '93, and a Jack Perkins essay.
We start tonight with the military confrontation in the Middle East. It is happening in southern Lebanon between Israeli forces and Muslim guerrillas. It is described as the most intense since the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. We get 2 views of what caused it and its possible consequences. Ori Nir is Washington Bureau Chief for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Hisham Melhem is Washington Bureau Chief for the Lebanese newspaper As-Safir. What caused this new fighting?
What caused this new fighting was a series of ongoing attacks by Hezbollah, the Muslim militia in southern Lebanon, against Israel, both against Israeli forces in the security zone, in the self-proclaimed security zone of Israel in southern Lebanon, and against Israeli civilians in northern Israel.
When did those attacks begin?
Those attacks, they've been occurring for, on and off for many years, but the latest wave has been taking place, I would say, for about 2 months or so, and it intensified very severely in the last 2-3 weeks.
And 7, we said in the news, I reported in the news summary that 7 Israeli soldiers were killed in those various attacks. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Do you agree, Bishop Mellon, with that? What's the initial cause of this?
Well, you have a bad situation of occupation made worse by 21 months of fruitless negotiations between the Arabs and Israelis, including the Lebanese and the Israelis. Those Israelis who were killed in South Lebanon, we should remind ourselves, were not innocently frolicking in South Beirut, Lebanon. They were members of an occupation army. It's a euphemism. The Israelis call it a security zone. Certainly we and Lebanese and everybody else call it an occupied territory. As long as there is no commitment from the Israelis and the Lebanese-Israeli peace talks for withdrawal from South Lebanon, as long as the Israelis refuse to accept Resolution 425, which was adopted in 1978, which called on them to withdraw from South Lebanon as part of the terms of reference of the negotiations, the Lebanese government cannot and will not, I think, try to prevent any Lebanese, Hezbollah or anybody else, from waging what the Lebanese believe as legitimate acts of resistance against an occupation.
So the Lebanese government is not going to step in and stop these attacks on Israel. So that as Israel's position is nobody else will do it, they have to do it themselves?
Absolutely, that's the situation. The Lebanese government unfortunately has not the power to stop those attacks. Therefore, Israel has had to create this buffer, this vitally needed buffer in southern Lebanon in order to keep the security of its people in the north.
What about that argument that do the Lebanese just reject the basic Israeli argument that if there is no buffer zone, then the people in the northern part of their country will be susceptible to random attacks?
Well, the Israeli logic stands on its head. I mean, you create a buffer to protect northern Israel. Then you have to create a buffer to protect the buffer, which includes Israeli soldiers. Now, the attacks that were waged by Hezbollah occurred on Lebanese territory, on occupied Lebanese territories. These are not, and the Lebanese maintain, and I think the international law would support them, that these are not acts of terror. I mean, the Israelis are very good in Orwellian language, but they have to stretch the definition of terrorism incredibly to cover the acts that were taking place in southern Lebanon as terrorist attacks. They were attacks against members of an occupation army, and as long as the Israelis don't contemplate seriously the question of withdrawal, these acts will continue, and no Lebanese government can stop them.
But Hisham, please let me intervene here. I mean, those latest, the Israeli action which was taken now was taken precisely as a result of Hezbollah attacks against civilians, against Israeli civilians in the north. More specifically, Katyusha attacks, those rocket attacks across the border into Israeli territory. So
not against military targets?
Not against military targets.
But the 7 soldiers died on Lebanese territory. They were died in ambushes against Israeli army occupation forces.
Secretary of State Christopher, who's on his way to the Middle East now, said today that he believes that the Hezbollah has launched these recent attacks because they want to stop the peace talks. Do you agree with that?
It's no secret Hezbollah is opposed to the peace talks, obviously, just as there are people in Israel who are opposed to these peace talks. The problem now with focusing on Hezbollah, certainly I don't share Hezbollah's political philosophy. I don't share their view.
What is their political philosophy?
Well, I mean, Hezbollah is a Muslim-oriented political party. It was established, incidentally, interestingly enough, in the wake of Israeli occupation of Lebanon, invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Before 1982, we had no Hezbollah. I would argue that Israeli actions contributed to the creation of groups such as Hezbollah. Hezbollah would like to...
It was also identified with much of the terrorist activities in Lebanon since, including the kidnapping of Americans and others.
That's
right?
true. That's true. Hezbollah is identified. Hezbollah has close relationship with Iran, which is not necessarily shared by many Lebanese. But the point is, I mean, one can make a distinction between Hezbollah's political philosophy, and certainly I don't share that, and Hezbollah's members, or right of Hezbollah as a Lebanese group to engage in acts of resistance against the Israelis. If the Israelis are trying to stomp Hezbollah, these actions, I would argue, will be counterproductive because Hezbollah gains its legitimacy from acts of resistance against the Israelis. If the Israelis focus on Hezbollah, attack Hezbollah continuously, they will make Hezbollah 10 feet tall.
What the Israelis are trying to create here, in my opinion, and it's being done with in military means because diplomacy didn't help, is to put pressure both on the Lebanese government and more so on Syria, which is, for all practical purposes, its political patron now.
There was some Syrian, we should make the point, there were some Syrian military targets involved in some of these attacks, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's true. I'll relate to it in just a second. But the point I wanted to make was that what Israel is trying to do is to, with military means, because diplomacy didn't help, put pressure on Syria, specifically on Syria, to restrain Hezbollah. And the message being sent to Damascus is, if you want the peace process to succeed, if you want the peace process to carry on, you have to restrain those elements in Lebanon on which you have enormous influence now, stop their activities, which is determined at the peace talk.
Because if you do not, Syria, and Hezbollah continues to attack Israeli targets, Israel is going to continue to retaliate. That's the message that is being delivered. Do you think that that this is going to work? That if Hezbollah is in fact trying to sabotage the peace talks, could this lead to that?
I think the success of the peace talks, I mean, of course, will make Hezbollah's actions moot. If the Israelis commit themselves to withdrawal, and then a timetable is established, then it will be the responsibility of the Lebanese government to maintain order on its side of the border.
And those discussions, we should make clear to our viewers who don't follow these things that carefully, there are several parts to the Mideast peace talks, and one of them is specifically between Israel and Lebanon about that and other issues.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
These negotiations have produced nothing really so far. Now the problem is sending...
specific ones on Lebanon.
On Lebanon, exactly.
Right.
Now the question is sending a message to Syria. Okay, you send a message to Assad. Assad is not going to open the envelope. Assad is going to tell you, and they are saying it publicly, that this is essentially a Lebanese issue. Syria's influence in Lebanon is very well known. But Syria, it's very simplistic. It's dead wrong to maintain or to claim that Syria can dictate terms in Lebanon as it wishes all the time. Certainly Syria's influence in Lebanon is very well taken. But Syria does not have any presence, military presence in South Lebanon. And Hezbollah still retains a degree of autonomy. And why should Assad? Assad would argue, I'm not the gendarmerie for Israel to protect the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. And I'll tell you, certainly the Syrians will not be unhappy if the Israelis are paying a price for their occupation of South Lebanon. I mean, certainly. I mean, that's.
But what does this do to the peace talks?
Well, I think if the Israelis do not escalate and embark on a ground attack, which I think it will be the height of folly, the current round of fighting will sour the trip of Secretary Christopher, but I don't think it will derail the talks.
What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Secretary Christopher's upcoming trip is almost destined to fail in that sense, because no matter what, I'm almost certain about that, it will focus on the latest occurrences, the current incidents.
He can't avoid talking about it.
Exactly, and since it's of such magnitude, I think you'll have to focus on it, and it will be at the price of actually trying to promote something between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel and the Syrians, which is badly needed in order to refuel the process.
So if Christopher is right, and that this was all started by the Hezbollah to foul up the Middle East peace talks, they will have succeeded.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it's going to escalate? Do you think that we'll be here, we on the NewsHour will be here tomorrow night saying for a third day Israel did this, and there were counterattacks with rockets the other way?
We should define what escalation is. I mean, I don't think it's going to escalate into any kind of ground campaign or anything of that sort. I think that it might carry on for a few more days if Hezbollah retaliates with rockets as they did in the first 2 days of this campaign. I think that the moment Hezbollah will stop its rocketing, Israel will also stop its bombarding.
How large a force does the Hezbollah have there?
Well, not more than 2,000, 2,500
These are armed,
full-time armed militiamen, yes. They have a relatively large number of supporters.
But if I read what you said earlier, They want to keep this thing going as long as they can.
I think they will keep it going on as long as they can, as long as they have
rockets.
support, as long as they have rockets, yes. And I think there is, the mood in Lebanon supports these acts against the Israelis. It doesn't mean that those who support these acts are subscribe necessarily to Hezbollah's political philosophy or political program. Many of them don't. But at the same time, many of them are frustrated with the continuing Israeli occupation of South Lebanon.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for clarifying it for us.
Still ahead on the NewsHour, the siege of Sarajevo, the economic impact of the Midwest flood, and SAS Jack Perkins. We turn now to another war, this one in Bosnia. There were reports tonight that France has asked for airstrikes against Serbian forces in the event there are any more attacks on French peacekeepers in Sarajevo. Today, the UN commander in Sarajevo said his forces would fire back if attacked again. Perhaps the UN troops are not used to direct assaults on their positions, but this kind of shelling has become part of daily life for many of Sarajevo's residents. Ian Williams of Independent Television News prepared this report from the Bosnian capital.
Several military vehicles were hit during yesterday's assault. 68 rounds were fired at the UN forces. It was the most prolonged direct attack on the UN since the conflict in Bosnia began. This morning, UN military observers assessed the damage. As they did so, the UN was stressing the role of existing ground forces in the city in any future retaliation, rather than calling on airstrikes against Serb positions from the 60 NATO aircraft now in Italy. Critics among aid agencies here still don't think it's enough.
The Security Council acted on June 3rd to declare this a safe haven. The implementation date was June 22nd. We have 60 aircraft in Italy waiting to protect UN personnel. If this isn't a provocation that ought to be replied to, I don't know what is. What else is left if the UN is not going to defend its own bases in a safe haven area?
The French United Nations bases in Sarajevo are tense and on high alert. The battalion the UN says was attacked by Serb tanks had only been in the city for a few days. It is located virtually on the front line separating the Serb and Bosnian government forces. And today, the new commander of UN forces, so conciliatory on his arrival a fortnight ago, said he had had enough.
What happened yesterday is totally unacceptable. The French unit was attacked by direct fire from Serb tanks or anti-tank weapons located just north of the stadium. I want you to know that is the last time that we restrain ourselves from exercising our right to self-defense.
Though the Serbs deny yesterday's attack, there is evidence that even before the assault, the UN was being targeted. We were filming at their main aid warehouse here. As we did so, a shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel pounded the roof. This led to a formal protest by the UN to the Serbs, who did not deny it was their shell. In spite of the attack on the UN, President Izetbegovic this morning left Sarajevo for Geneva, having decided he will attend tomorrow's peace talks, even though the ceasefire has failed. The last 3 days have seen some of the heaviest and most sustained shelling of Sarajevo for several weeks. Thousands of shells and bullets have been fired indiscriminately into the city. Yet, remarkably, in the midst of all this, a life of sorts does go on. Before the war, this was always a grudge match. And at the weekend, in spite of the shelling, wrestlers from two of Sarajevo's leading sports clubs met in one of the city's bomb-damaged but still functioning sports centres. Later, they made way for young boxers from the two clubs, Željeznica and Bosna. Boxing, wrestling and other contact sports were always popular before the siege, and these were the city's top clubs. Among those competing were ethnic Croats and Serbs, who still live beside the Muslims in the government-controlled parts of the city. Game over, and both sides were given prizes. No medals, though. Instead, something far more valuable to them. A bag of humanitarian aid, sugar, flour and beans for each of the competitors.
Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfill.
In a nearby hall, the Bosnian children's choir were practicing. Before the siege, they spent much of their time touring Europe and other parts of the former Yugoslavia. Now, of course, there is no opportunity to tour, but still an enthusiasm to practice. We were asked not to film the outside of this hall or the sports centre, the Bosnians fearing they would become targets of Serb artillery. As if to emphasize that point, this shell exploded in a street not far from the hall, shortly after we had filmed the choir. There is hardly a building in the city which does not bear the scars of 16 months of bombardment. A bombardment that has killed or wounded hundreds of people. Yet in the midst of this devastation, the Bosnians are continuing to provide their children with basic education. Each local settlement has a war school. The children and their teacher live in the same or neighboring apartment blocks, and the small classrooms are in the safest parts of the blocks, in the basement or on the ground floor with a minimum number of windows. The idea is that the children do not have to dodge snipers by traveling long distances to school.
The school is very important because the children were without any responsibilities for the last year. They were just listening to the shelling and listening to the news on the TV and radio. When the school started, the children's mood completely changed. They have very good friendships, and they tell me, we feel great going to school. But it isn't important how much they learn, although they learn a lot. It's important children continue to have friendships, and they keep up their spirits.
These 14-year-olds are studying maths. They come to school 6 days a week. Among them is Mirza Shirankaba, who lives with his parents and elder brother Yasmin in a neighboring apartment block. Inside his apartment, Mirza reckons he does more homework now than ever before. There's not much else to do. Since the Serbs cut the power 2 months ago, he's lost his favorite pastime, watching videos or playing computer games. Mirza's father, who was a power engineer before the war, is cultivating a small vegetable patch to supplement the family's meager aid ration. There has been no fresh aid here for 3 weeks.
The quantity of humanitarian aid isn't enough, so we have to spend our earnings from before the war to buy food on the black market, which is very expensive. 1 kilo of flour costs about 10 Deutschmarks.
Nobody has been untouched by the war. Yasmin was recently with his closest friend when a shell exploded beside them.
We were sitting in the front of the shop in the neighborhood. The mortar fell and injured him in the leg. The shrapnel weighed about 1 kilogram. They say it was a miracle that they saved his life.
In spite of the increasing hardships, the family still does not want to see their government compromise with the Serbs.
I'm no politician, but I think that President Izetbegovic should keep to his principles and not divide Bosnia-Herzegovina. The country should remain united because of all the nationalities who live here.
Both boys are keen skiers. They have their own new equipment, and before the siege would take advantage of a long skiing season in the local mountains. Their favorite slopes were on Mount Igman, which is now the center of the fiercest fighting in the area. The family presents a remarkable picture of dignity against the most appalling odds. Yet, like everybody in this city, life for them has become much harder since power and water were cut, and they are increasingly impatient at the failure of the UN to persuade the Serbs to reconnect it. This is the man whose job it is to do just that. Major Nicholas Studa is the UN officer in charge of utilities. Some regard his job as one of the most frustrating and dangerous in the city. Today, he's on his way to one of 11 electricity substations in the city. The station at Veleshici was shelled by the Serbs at the weekend and is now out of action. The UN thinks it was deliberately targeted. Now Studer and his colleagues must assess the damage.
The current measuring transformer, phase number 4, completely destroyed.
Major Studer works with a small team of UN engineers. 5 of them have been injured by bullets or shrapnel from shells fired at them while trying to repair power lines.
It's impossible to reach the road location. For example, we want to repair the line, the only one line, which is supplying Sarajevo, and it's impossible to go there because you heard that there are fierce fighting.
By night, Sarajevo presents an eerie picture. There is total darkness. Nobody dare walk or drive on the streets. The silence is only broken by the occasional thud of shelling or crack of gunfire as the pitch black is cut by lines of tracer.
Next, assessing the economic impact of the Midwestern floods. As flooding continues in many places and the cleanup begins in others, estimates of the economic damage change almost daily. We know the numbers will be large, but we're not sure who will be hurt and why and what effect there will be on the national economy. In a moment, we'll talk with 2 economists. But first, this report from correspondent Spencer Michaels.
Though the most dramatic images of the past few weeks have been of farmland overrun by swollen rivers and streams, the magnitude of this spring and summer's rains stretches far beyond the riverbanks. Steve Johnson lives and farms 2 miles from the Skunk River near Story City, Iowa. He has a big operation, 2,000 acres, planted in corn and soybeans, the same 2 staple crops his father cultivated for years before him. This year, Johnson is hurting.
Is what's going on now at all usual? Are you used to this?
No, never seen rain like this before, and probably ever. And
how bad has it been? How much rain has there been?
For the month of July, we've had approximately 16 inches so far, and looks like today we're getting a little bit more.
And that's 16 inches in an area where the average rainfall is?
For the total month of July, it's approximately 4.5 inches, I suppose, to 5 at the most.
Johnson's lands are a soggy mess. The corn that's still standing isn't as tall as it should be. Row upon row of the rest of his corn has disappeared underwater.
This was all corn?
Yeah.
Had you actually planted it?
Yeah, it's all been planted and all came up good, and then the old water came and it drowned it all out. There's probably half of it that's gone out there out of 80 acres.
I don't know about you, but looking at this, for me, it's sort of depressing, isn't it?
Oh, it is. But I guess a lot of things you can't help, and I guess that's our weather. And you just have to face consequences like this. And
there's not even a river near here, is there?
No. This is just flat farm, good farm ground, productive farm ground, and with all this rain, you just get this.
Even though Johnson doesn't farm beside a river, the rain has saturated his land and caused large ponds to spread across his field. All this excess groundwater will cause Johnson to lose as much as a third of his crops, he thinks.
I guess your projected income off of an acre, you try to be somewhere around $300 an acre. And if you lose 30% of it or so, it runs $90, $100 an acre.
And if you got 2,000 acres, that sounds like there's $200,000 there that you're not making.
You're correct to a certain point there. That's of income that you won't have coming in. It isn't an all loss, but it's an income that you won't have coming in.
Jim Penny, the agronomist for the grain elevator where Steve Johnson usually brings his crops to be sold, knows how economic hardship can spread.
Well, along the way, with the reduced crop size, we'll be affected. We'll be handling less bushels. Consequently, we'll be paying for less bushels to the farmer. He'll have less money in his pocket this fall. He'll be less likely to trade cars, trade pickups, trade farm equipment, or buy a new piece of equipment that he's been needing for a few years. He won't be remodeling his home. He won't be building a new machine shed. This will have a ripple effect into the entire nation's economy.
But all is not bleak. The 900 farmers who, along with Steve Johnson, own this cooperative grain elevator have known good years as well as bad. And last year was such a good year, there's a chance the surplus soybean and corn, which still remain in the elevator, will offset this year's losses. Neil Harl is an agricultural analyst at Iowa State University.
Based upon our current damage that we can see clearly to date, that the impact on food prices will be quite modest. And that's because of several things. Number one, corn has been stored from the 1992 crop especially, which was a very good crop, and much of that has remained in storage, a significant part of it. A second factor is that while this is a highly visible part of the Corn Belt and one of the major corn-producing and soybean-producing areas, Corn Belt is a huge part of the country, and there are good crops, particularly to the east of us. The third reason why the impact on food prices will be very modest is that the price that the farmer gets for the products is a modest percentage of the supermarket price in any event.
No matter how much grain is still available, it has to get to market. Barge traffic on the Mississippi has come to a standstill. And miles of track have been washed out, causing railroads to busily rebuild. Disruptions, such as this one, throughout the Midwest, forced shippers to reroute their goods. But while the co-op, and through the co-op, the individual farmers will lose money, the nation will not feel a substantial economic impact. In fact, despite the money Congress will allocate for disaster relief, the flooding may produce a silver lining for the U.S. Treasury: diminished payments in farm subsidies. Farm subsidies are normally given to augment low prices, but with crop prices higher due to the flooding, the government will probably have to pay farmers less.
This will mean that funds that otherwise would have been paid out for subsidies can be paid, if that is the desire of Congress, or at least account for a portion of the disaster assistance.
Prices will remain elevated long after the waters have receded, because investors and traders working out of the Chicago Board of Trade have bid up the prices of future deliveries of soybeans in anticipation of a smaller crop.
We got corn rallying pretty good here, too. Now we're up a penny on the corn. I think it's looking pretty good.
And some farmers have been speculating on these future prices as well, figuring it's one way to make the best of a bad situation. Sue Martin is a broker in Webster City, Iowa.
Farmers are a very optimistic breed. So if it looks to them like the crop is not going to materialize out in their fields, they're certainly going to be trying to replace those bushels back on the board of the Chicago Board of Trade and try to catch the price fluctuation on paper. They never see the actual bushels, but all they care about is the difference of where they buy it and where they eventually sell out that commodity that they're trading.
So you're saying that these farmers who may not be making it in the field are calling you and speculating on the market?
Yes, they are. We've been trading long in soybeans and corn for a good month and doing very well.
Steve Johnson hopes he will do well on the futures market, but looking at his fields, he finds it hard to see any silver lining.
Oh, it takes a long time to dry out. Our subsoil, our below will never get dried up probably this till fall or late because of all the surface water and everything.
For the rest of the summer, investors, farmers, and the rest of the nation will be checking the skies to see how this year's harvest turns out.
As the flooding itself continues without any end in sight, judging the economic impact becomes more and more iffy. The only certainty is that the numbers are going up, not down. We have two people to help us sort this out this evening. Lawrence H. Meyer is president of Meyer & Associates, a national economic forecasting firm based in St. Louis. And Diane Swank is the senior regional economist and vice president of the First National Bank of Chicago. Good evening to you both. Ms. Swank, do you take the view that most economists share that aside from the personal tragedies, the economic loss in the Midwest is going to be modest?
Unfortunately, I think that's true, and I say unfortunate because often economic statistics really don't reflect what's going on, at least in the near term. Certainly the personal losses are tremendous and in some cases much greater than those of Hurricane Andrew. Many people, remember, did not have insurance, flood insurance, and they have to pay for all of the cleanup on their own. Now, in a larger context, though, I think it's important. Part of the cleanup today is masking some of the longer-term costs here, and there's two issues that are important. One, the floods are only a symptom of something that's been larger that's going on in the Midwest for quite some time. Frankly, we've had lousy weather here since about January. It means that a lot of construction activity that was anticipated and indeed planned for this year has already been delayed. And it's an especially big problem here in the Midwest, unlike it was in Florida, where you could move on to the fourth quarter and pick up much of what you had lost and do the reconstruction with it. Here in the Midwest, we get snow in the fourth quarter. And so if we don't get some dry weather soon, some of the construction activity that was lost earlier in the year may not be made up until 1994. So some businesses will really suffer due to that. Of course, it is a mixed economic bag. Trucking in here in Illinois has picked up as a result of some of the rerouting around the Mississippi out there. But a longer-term consequence, I think, is also important for some of these state and local governments is how much they're going to get covered from the federal government in terms of this cleanup. In many cases, these small and local communities have already spent close to their annual budget for the year just in the cost of dealing with the flood, not any of the cleanup, not any of the infrastructure losses. And that's very important to remember because this is a time when state and local governments all through the 1980s and certainly today have already been very strapped for cash.
Let me ask Mr. Meyer, if I may, for a quick view of the impact of the Midwestern flooding on the rest of the nation.
Well, I think your report had it exactly right. The personal hardships in the affected areas are quite dramatic, but the impact for the national economy is really quite modest. There will be, I think, a discernible impact slowing growth in the third quarter as we recognize the crop damages and on account of loss of production elsewhere. People who can't go to work, less retail sales occurring because incomes are lower. And then in the fourth quarter, as the cleanup proceeds and the rebuilding takes place, we'll see economic activity higher than it otherwise would have been. We'll see a higher growth rate in the fourth quarter.
How do you, Mr. Meyer, how do you measure, for instance, the crop damage on the grocery bill for the rest of the nation?
With great uncertainty, to be sure. But we do have historical precedents. You know, we can see the kind of crop damage that occurred, for example, with the drought and compare that. And this crop damage is really very, very much smaller than that. I think we're going to see a quite modest impact to the food component of the CPI and a very, very small impact, one which is almost not going to be observable to the consumer in the overall consumer price index.
Ms. Wong, a moment ago you mentioned the impact on the town. St. Louis, of course, the biggest the city in the Central Valley, is big enough, I guess, and rich enough to take care of itself. But what about those little towns that you were talking about, like St. Genevieve and up and down the river? I read the other day that Quincy, Illinois, had already spent nearly $500,000 on 1.5 million bags of sand.
Right. This is a much harder issue for some of these small towns because unlike a larger city like St. Louis, they don't have anything to fall back on. And the larger issue, of course, is if people don't rebuild in the area after the flood is over, they lose much of their future tax base as well. So not only are they depleting current funds, they're losing funds in the future here. So I think we have a risk, a very high risk, if much of the flooding is not covered by some of the federal outlays, which is also difficult at this point in time. We have a risk of some of these towns actually going bankrupt and unfortunately drying up after the flood.
Just by chance, do you know where all that sand comes from?
Sorry about that. I don't know where the sand comes from.
You mentioned a moment ago that there was a danger of towns actually vanishing along the river?
Absolutely. Especially some of the smaller towns. We're talking about, even for the Midwest, it's not as big of an economic impact because most of the areas hit are not very highly populated areas. These are farm communities, some of them almost solely dependent on farming. And especially those communities, you have a real strong risk of them disappearing entirely because they just don't have another economic base to fall back on. Now, in a broader context, it doesn't mean we're going to lose all those farms. It means that there'll be some consolidation out there. We do produce plenty of soybeans and corn. As your article illustrated, we have corn and soybeans left over from last year to fall back on this year. But it does mean some great personal tragedies that just don't show up in all the economic statistics. In a more long-term context for the Midwest, it could be more state and local government fiscal problems that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Mr. Meyer, a moment ago you were talking about the loss of the economic damage from the structural loss. The other day, Laura Tyson, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, said the lack of resources could limit the economic stimulus from rebuilding after the flood. What did she mean by that?
Well, I think one of the differences in this case, say relative to recent hurricanes, is there was much less private insurance. So we are much more dependent on federal assistance in the rebuilding effort. And we can see already in Congress that there are sort of debates going on as to whether or not this money for the relief effort should be appropriated on top of other elements in the budget, or whether or not spending cuts should be found elsewhere. We're in a deficit-constrained world, which makes it very difficult for the federal government to do as much as we might like. And for that same reason, we have fiscal crises all around in terms of state and local governments. They're very hard-pressed to carry out these efforts as well. So in this context, with lack of private insurance and constraints on what the public sector can do, this can certainly be a factor that could restrain the normal kind of cleanup and rebuilding effort that would boost output in the subsequent quarters.
Does the inability of people in the Midwest to get to the stores and buy groceries, buy clothes, buy replacements, does that have a ripple effect on retail sales around the country?
Sure it does. As the report said, we call it sometimes a multiplier effect. It sort of multiplies the effect within the region, and it tends to spread it out over the rest of the country, since these retail goods that would have been bought would have been produced all over the country. So everybody feels in a much attenuated way, for sure, some of the impacts that are going on here.
Some economists I have read, Mr. Meyer, now say that the damage, the economic loss from the flooding will now estimated at $12 billion, will surpass $25 billion, and this will go down as the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. Do you foresee that?
I wouldn't even hazard a guess at this point. I'll tell you that I made a round of some calls today to some government agencies, and they were all wise enough not to want to put any numbers to these losses right now. These are wild guesses at this point.
Ms. Wonk, on the July 19th issue of Business Week, the editors wrote, with luck, the effects of the disaster should be limited, even in the Midwest. Is that your view?
I think that is my view, and certainly the luck is the important component here, and that's the weather. If we were to get some drier weather between now and the end of September and October, we could complete some of the rebuilding, and that would certainly mitigate some of the losses associated with the floods. Some of the crops are already gone, but some of the reconstruction effort would certainly create some jobs that we've already lost in construction. If, however, the weather remains wet, and some forecasters are certainly calling through August now for many heavy rains, we've got a real problem, especially here in the Midwest, where, of course, we're backing up against snow in the fourth quarter. And so the luck is the important component. There's another issue I think is important, too, and that's the difference between the industrialized Midwest and, of course, the more agricultural Midwest. The industrialized Midwest, luckily, because the flood occurred in July, so far it has not really disrupted much auto production. It's not disrupted much manufacturing activity here in the Midwest, which is also extremely important. We've seen it take its toll on things like auto sales, where people just can't go out and buy their trucks or autos right now, but that we should pick up a little bit later. So I think that is true with some luck. It can be somewhat consolidated on how much losses we're feeling here.
Are there any parts of the economy in the Midwest, Ms. Wonk, that are actually booming because of the flood?
That's a really good point. We are seeing some benefits. Booming, I don't know necessarily, although, even retail sales, what's interesting, the most recent surveys done on the retail sales data show that many of the areas that have been flooded, people are already going out to buy some refrigerators and appliances to replace flood-damaged items. That's very important because we're already getting some offset with some big-ticket sales out there. Some, of course, hardware stores are doing very well in this kind of environment. Much like during Hurricane Andrew, in the preparation for Hurricane Andrew, we had people buying a lot of plywood to board up their windows. Similar kinds of things are happening here in the Midwest. I don't see any boomtown out there. Of course, the issue that we've had lousy weather since January has already hurt construction, and that's been more of an overshadow that we've had to deal with, and we're already feeling the pain from even before July statistics come out. We've seen June losses in housing starts, largely because we've had a lot of rain here.
One final quick question and quick answer. Was the Midwest strong enough before this happened to sustain the losses that it will take?
Well, I hate to say this, but I guess it's true. Of all the places for this flood to occur, the Midwest was probably the best positioned region to have it happen. We were in already a good economic position, and the underlying economy is strong enough to sustain it, even though the pain of it is so bad.
Thank you very much for talking to us, Ms. Swank and Mr. Meyer.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, essayist Jack Perkins with some advice for the members of Congress sorting out their budget differences.
This is a deceiving time of year in our town. A seasonal seashore town in season. Sidewalks teem, stores bustle. Captain Greg Curry is back at the helm, taking a load of tourists out to watch whales. Cliff Vandenbosch, who runs the kayak rentals, now has 100 boats. Busy fellow. Busy town. In shop windows and restaurants, you see a lot of help wanted signs. And pay isn't bad. A lot of places pay well over minimum for summer help. So all in all, looking around our town these days, the economy seems robust. But, as I said, this is a deceiving time of year. One of the problems with our national economy has always been the fact that we cannot see it. The deficit, be it malignant or benign, is invisible. The national debt, aside from being of an incomprehensible scale, is abstract. And we don't deal well with the abstract and the invisible. We're much better with what we can see and grasp. So, let me take you one more place in our town. This is the local hangout, Jordan's Variety. There is no Jordan anymore. Dave Payne runs the place. And this year, locals have noticed that he has jacked up a few prices. Like cheeseburgers are up 25 cents, up to $2.95. Dave is getting a little razzing. He has a winter place down in Florida and has been spending more time there recent years. So is that why he had to bump cheeseburgers a quarter?
Thanks, Brendan. You're welcome.
One of the regulars who wondered is Earl Brecklin, editor of the local weekly. He did a story about it. This is a small town, don't forget. But after talking with Dave, Earl decided that what we've got here is not just a few prices changed on a local menu, but an abstraction made concrete. As his headline put it, Economics and the Cheeseburger, Uncertainty Principle. He quoted Dave as saying that not only are costs going up, but they are costs over which he has no control. For example, his workman's compensation insurance this year alone jumped $3,500. So if we're talking 25 cents more per cheeseburger, it'll take the increase from 14,000 cheeseburgers just to catch up with workman's comp. His property tax, meanwhile, rose $1,500. Add another 6,000 cheeseburgers. Unemployment, he has some 20 employees, is up $1,600. That's another 6,400 cheeseburgers. Keep flipping them, Dave. And those are just the increased costs he knows about. Where the real anxiety comes is from the ones he doesn't. What will the new energy tax cost him by the time his suppliers tack on energy increases? Maybe 10,000 cheeseburgers worth? If so, we're up to 36,400 cheeseburgers. It will take the extra quarter from that many just for him to stay even. Now, Dave Payne already works 7 days a week. He'd like to give employees raises, but can he? Maybe hire a few more. But dare he? Uncertain, he has decided to decide nothing, to make no major business changes, at least for now. Some people in Washington don't seem to understand why businesses aren't hiring people, why the economy isn't expanding as they would like. Well, maybe they need to leave Washington. Come to Jordan's Variety and count cheeseburgers.
Ordering, please. 4 cheeseburgers, 2 medium, 1 well, 1 rare. The rare's a deluxe.
I'm Jack Perkins.
again, the major stories of this Monday. The Midwest braced for more flooding and more rain. Israel stepped up its attacks against Muslim targets in southern Lebanon, and constitutional talks continued in South Africa despite a massacre at a mostly white church in Cape Town. Good night, Roger.
Good night, Jim. That's the News Hour for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night with some Midwestern governors who are taking their case for flood aid directly to President Clinton. I'm Roger Mudd. Good night.
Major funding for the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
I'm Nancy Marshall with OPB Radio. Tomorrow morning from 5 to 9 on OPB Radio, it's Morning Edition. Tomorrow, industrial secrets are at the center of an investigation involving General Motors and Volkswagen. That's tomorrow morning on OPB Radio.
Video cassettes of the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
Funding for local broadcast of the MacNeil Lehrer News Hour has